much, Professor Yu, for inviting me here and for the Naval Academy for hosting me. I'm delighted to be here to get to know you, as I hope I will in the course of this discussion. I'm going to speak, I guess, for about 30 minutes, and then I think the more interesting period of our conversation will be when we throw it open to questions. So I hope we can get on to that fairly quickly. I want to start off with a quote which I think is just very revealing. And one of the curious things about this quote is from a book I wrote called Jesus in Beijing. And it has appeared on the internet more than anything else I have ever written. I'm not quite sure why, but I think it's sort of, and it's appeared in other people's books too. So forgive me if I quote myself, or at least I quote not myself, but quote a person in a book that I wrote. 18 American tourists on a visit to China in the late summer of 2001, bushed, tired, a bit bored with all the sights they'd seen. They were sort of basically tracing the routes taken by earlier generations of Western missionaries. And some fellow who had been putting together the schedule had arranged for them to have a meeting at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, or at least with a representative from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, a very distinguished organization that does a lot of research on social and political topics relating to China and the rest of the world, for that matter. And the general reaction of these people was, oh, we've been to the Great Wall, we've done the Temple of Heaven, we've done the Silk Market. What do we want to hear a lecture from some social scientist at this stage of the game? However, when they got there, they were really quite surprised. And let me tell you why. This is what he said. One of the things, this is the Chinese social scientist speaking, one of the things we were asked to look into was what accounted for the success, in fact, the preeminence of the West all over the world. We studied everything we could from historical, political, economic, and cultural perspective. At first, we thought it was because you had more powerful guns than we had. Next, we focused on your political system, which a lot of people said was the best. Then we focused on your economic system. But in the past 20 years, we have realized that the heart of your culture is your religion, Christianity. That is why the West has been so powerful. The Christian moral foundation of social and cultural life was what made possible the emergence of capitalism and then the successful transition to democratic politics. We don't have any doubt about this. I'm sorry you can't say the same thing of any reporter for the New York Times, but this is a Chinese secularist. As far as I know, he's not a church member or anything like that, but a social scientist who has followed, if you like, the course of social development in different religious conditions. And he had come to the conclusion that Christianity was an extraordinarily central element of the success of the West. And now it doesn't take a genius to figure out you can make quite a strong case for that. But the interesting thing is that this case was made by somebody in China who was secular, wasn't a church member, and had simply followed the money where it led, if you like, to use an academic expression. What I want to do is tell you a little bit of background about an extraordinary situation that's going on in the world today. That situation is a very large number of Chinese citizens are becoming Christian believers. They're joining churches. They are assuming roles at fairly high levels in different parts of society, in the academic life, in the judiciary, even in the political structure. One of my recent friends is, I should say, a very high-placed Communist Party official who writes editorials for the leaders in the People's Daily, who happens to be a Christian. Now, this is just extraordinary. The society is going through a major transformation, and I won't sort of go through the whole of my book, but I basically make a prediction that it is possible. Academics always have to say it's possible, and they shouldn't be very dogmatic. It's possible that within 20 years or so, the demographics of China will look like a population in which about 25 to 30% of the population are Christian believers, very serious churchgoers. And all you need to know is that in every society that has been Christianized, including places like South Korea, which of course also was democratized, largely, I think, as a result of the Christian influence in society, it only takes about 25% of the population to be committed to a particular faith, in this case Christianity, for the whole of the cultural balance in the society to change. Now, I think that is an extremely interesting thing. It may not happen. There are all kinds of things that could happen in China. People have made careers out of being wrong in their predictions in China. I don't want to join them, so all I'll say is a lot of things could go wrong with this picture. But the fact is, this does seem to be the direction in which China is moving at the grassroots, and it is going to have an extraordinary impact on the rest of the world. Well, how do we get this to this point? In 1949, when the People's Liberation Army marched into Beijing, I think it was January, wasn't it? And over the next few months gradually took over the whole country. It didn't take long before the Christian missionaries and church members and leaders were expelled from the country, as many people thought perhaps for the last time ever. And a lot of folks concluded that with the triumph of communism and the expulsion of the missionaries, this would probably be the end of the Christian faith in China. And it certainly looked that way as one proceeded to watch events in the 1950s with the 100 Flowers movement, followed by the anti-rightist campaign, and then the Great Leap Forward. The anti-rightist campaign is an event that a lot of Americans are not aware of, but they should be, because something like 300,000 Chinese intellectuals were banished to the countryside because they were considered to have had incorrect political influences as young people. And many of them, of course, died in exile. Some of them were brought up in places, and their children were brought up in places like Xinjiang and so on for 20 years before they were allowed back. And then you had the Great Leap Forward, when perhaps as many as 42 to 47 million Chinese perished because of a man-made famine, a famine basically orchestrated by the Chinese leader Mao Zedong. And then the Cultural Revolution, which started in 1966 and was well known for having led to the closure of every single place of worship of any faith in the whole of China. Churches were closed, turned into pigsties or warehouses, temples, mosques, everything was closed down. And again, people thought, well, my gosh, we must have seen the end of any kind of faith tradition in China. The atheists have finally triumphed, and look what they have wrought. But it's very interesting, because what actually happened during the Cultural Revolution, which did result in a lot of very serious persecution of people of faith, people were arrested, beaten, sometimes actually executed for owning a Bible or a Quran or Buddhist scriptures or what have you. But the interesting thing about the Cultural Revolution in China is two things. Well, many more than two things, but two things that struck me. One is that the Cultural Revolution destroyed the belief amongst ordinary Chinese in the veracity of Marxism-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, as a valid theory of politics and life. I lived for China in 2 years as a reporter in Beijing. This was in the early 80s. And I used to go around, because the foreign ministry organized all kinds of tours for us reporters, and we had our own devices, our own curiosity to satisfy when they weren't organizing things. But I went around Beijing and every part of China that I was allowed to go to with a very firm topic of investigation in mind. I wanted to meet communists. And in 2 years of meeting gazillion Communist Party members, I only met 5 people in the whole of China. Of course, I didn't meet the whole of China, but I met 5 people amongst all the people I was introduced to who actually believed this stuff. So, I mean, this is extraordinary. Of course, 1982, the beginning of the reform period, and all kinds of things are beginning to happen in China, foreign investment, capitalism, and so forth. But even so, it was very, very hard to find anybody who believed in Marxism-Leninism. So what that led to was a kind of philosophical vacuum. And everybody knows what happens to any vacuum in any kind of situation. If you have a philosophical vacuum, it is going to be filled one way or another. And the second thing about the Cultural Revolution that's very interesting is that the people of faith who were best organized, not only at preserving their faith communities, but in spreading the message of their faith, were the Christians, were the Chinese Christians. And what then developed is that when China began to open up socially in the, I guess, the half-dozen years after the end of the Cultural Revolution, after Mao's death in 1976, many Chinese officials didn't know what the rules were about religion. They really weren't sure. And in that period, there was an extraordinary expansion of the church. I'll just give you a few examples from my reporting that I did for the book, Jesus in Beijing, which I don't think anybody else had done before I had a chance to do it. I met with some of the house church, large Christian networks. And one of them explained that they had come together, I think in the early 90s, perhaps 1992, 1993, and they had decided to send 72 or something like, well, 72 is a bad number because that connotes sort of Muslim virgins and so forth, and so it wasn't 72, it must have been 70 or 69. Anyway, they sent out 2 by 2 these young missionaries, I mean 19 years old, young Chinese, all over China. And they gave them enough money to get to destination B, and they said, we're not going to pay for your return trip. You're going to have to get the money to come back if you want to come back and sell your blood or whatever it is. And they brought them back after about 3 or 4 months. Nobody, fortunately, died on the trip, although it could have been quite hazardous if people were arrested. But when they came back, these 70 or so young people, they had absolutely extraordinary stories to tell. Because wherever they had gone to different parts of the countryside, and this was not in China's cities, I hasten to say, where the situation was a little difficult and different, but mostly in rural areas, wherever they had gone, they had found the most extraordinarily receptive audience to the Christian message. And as a result, many of these networks now have membership, if that's the right word, at least numbers in the millions who belong to an identifiable group and originally grew up through missionary efforts started maybe in the late 80s or early 90s. So that has dramatically changed the rural situation in China. Now, what's happening in the cities? China's intellectuals, on the whole, have been fairly resistant to faith of any kind until quite recently. And modern Chinese history in the 20th century is characterized by periods of great suspicion of Westerners, Western missionaries, and so forth. But the fact is that China's professional and intellectual class is turning to the Christian faith in very, very large numbers in all the major cities of China. Just to give you one example, one of the house churches in Beijing, which is not an underground church, it's an official church. They've tried to register with the government. They don't want to do anything illegally. The Shouwang House Church has thousands of members, and they actually raised a couple of years ago about 25 million yuan, which I suppose is about $8 million, something like that, to purchase a location in which to worship. Well, of course, that didn't go down too well with the authorities, who prevented them from getting the lease and then kicked them out of the places where they had temporarily been renting, and got to the point where these unfortunate church members were forced to have their worship services on the outskirts of the Haidian Park in the middle of winter. They weren't even allowed into the park itself. So there's a big tussle going on now between China's Christians, who are trying to do things legally. They're trying not to rock the boat. They're trying to work within the limits of the legal system in finding places to worship and finding places to express their faith. Now, if you look back at Chinese history, you have to ask yourself, was there anything like this ever before? Did China adopt any religion in a sort of major way? Well, of course it did, because China has a very strong Buddhist tradition. Muslims have been in China certainly since about the 6th or 7th century. And the first Christians who were noticed in Chinese documentation were missionaries who arrived from probably what is now Iraq, representing the Church of the East, as it was then called, or the Nestorians. about 635 AD. And if you ever have a chance to go to the city of Xi'an, I'm sure that the first place they will take you is to the Terracotta Warriors, which is certainly worth seeing. But there's a very interesting museum in Xi'an called the Forest of Stelae, S-T-E-L-A-E, and that's a collection of carved stone monuments. And one of the most fascinating monuments is the so-called Nestorian tablet, which was carved about the year 781 actually, about 150 years after the Nestorians arrived, commemorating the very warm reception that the Christian missionaries from Asia, from the Church of the East, received from the then Tang Dynasty emperor. And so Christianity was really rather well received when it first made a big, impressive entrance. Then, of course, other things happened. China was conquered by the Mongols, and in the Ming Dynasty, there was sort of a revival of indigenous Chinese faith based on Taoism, and the first Ming Dynasty emperors were sort of also actually Buddhist, Messianic Buddhist characters. And so the Nestorian Christians were kind of chased out of the place and more or less suppressed. The next great arrival was that of the Italian Jesuit Matteo Ricci. Now, Ricci was an extraordinary man. I mean, the Jesuits of the mid-16th century were the equivalent, in today's terms, of somebody who'd got about 4 or 5 different PhDs in nuclear physics, in medicine, in astronomy, and in Asian languages. I mean, essentially that. Ricci, for example, had trained his memory, as many scholars did in the Renaissance period, by using special memory techniques. And he was so brilliant that he could sit down at a dinner party. One of the guests at the dinner party, these are all Chinese of course, would recite a Tang Dynasty poem, maybe of 20 lines. Ricci would listen to it once and then repeat the poem flawlessly from start to finish without making a single mistake. I mean, this is just extraordinary. He was a very brilliant man, and he, excuse me, he was followed by equally brilliant Jesuit leaders, many of whom had close relations to the Chinese emperors. There is a tradition amongst China's Christian community that the Kangxi emperor, who was really the greatest of all China's emperors during the Qing dynasty, in the early period of the Qing dynasty in the 17th century, was very close to being a Christian, or at least to becoming a Christian. He certainly wasn't baptized. He drew the line at that. But he wrote poems which indicate that he was very attracted to the gospel message that he'd heard from Adam Schall and Ferdinand Verbiest, a brilliant Dutch successor to Matteo Ricci. Well, alas, controversies in the Roman Catholic Church resulted in a big dispute about whether China should be allowed to continue cultural practices of venerating ancestors. And the Jesuits said this is merely a civic honor, there's nothing religious about it. But the Dominicans and the Franciscans said, no, 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 this is much too religious. We can't have Chinese doing that if they become Christian. This would sort of sully the faith. So that led to all of the Catholics being kicked out of China in about the year 1722. And again, it looked as though the Chinese Christian community had disappeared. The next arrival was, of course, the Englishman Robert Morrison, the first Protestant missionary who arrived in 1807 and started painstakingly to translate the Bible. He didn't get very far with it, but he did make some Chinese followers. He did help them become Christian. And finally, a real big missionary input came with a man called Hudson Taylor, another Englishman who founded the China Inland Mission. And it's safe to say that all China's Christian leaders basically learned their Christianity from people who were trained by the China Inland Mission. And that is probably why the nature of the Christian faith in China is so vigorous, so strong, and so unafraid. It's because the people who brought it to the different parts of China were very vigorous, strong, and very unafraid, and willing, in many cases, to give their lives. For example, in the Boxer Rebellion of the year 1900, in which 280 missionaries were killed by the Boxer rebels, of that number, the missionaries who were China Inland Mission missionaries were 189. And it's an astonishing testimony to the kind of courage. In any event, China's had ups and downs in openness and lack of receptiveness to the Christian gospel, but the fact is that it's there to stay. And I would argue, somewhat mischievously perhaps, that China is acquiring Christianity at about the same pace that the United States is losing it, at least amongst intellectuals. And maybe they'll send some of their missionaries over here when they've accomplished what they need to accomplish. So I'll stop there and open it up for Christians, and perhaps you have some things you want to bring up. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Question. In running down the history of Christianity in China, how do you make sense then of something like the Taiping
Very good question, yeah.
Which is in some ways an indigenous Christian movement that ends quite badly for everyone concerned. How is that remembered, or at least what do Christians make of that?
That's a very good question. For those of you who don't know, who don't go to bed at night thinking about the Taiping Rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion is in the Guinness Book of Records as the most destructive national rebellion of any country in the world. Something like 20 million Chinese were killed before the Taiping Rebellion, which lasted from about 1850 to 1864, was finally suppressed. Now, the thing about the Taiping Rebellion is it was led by a Chinese who had been handed a tract by another Chinese who had acquired the tract from a missionary. And the tract was a basic version of Christianity. But the Chinese who received this tract, Hong Xiuquan, was was a Hakka, a member of a minority tribe in the southwest of China. He was going through all kinds of emotional and physical crises. To cut a long story short, he came up with the idea when he started this rebellion that he was the younger brother of Jesus, which doesn't go down with traditional Christian missionaries very well. But he organized a following of people who observed in many respects the Jewish legal system of the Old Testament. And in a good sense, the Hakkas did not have foot binding of women, which is a really very unpleasant kind of torture of women. But he abolished foot binding for women. He kept strict segregation of the sexes. And the missionaries who first saw this thought, oh, this is great. You know, that finally some Chinese peasant has discovered Christianity. But it very quickly became clear that his doctrine was really muddled up with all kinds of spiritism and stuff that wasn't Christian at all. And tragically, his rebellion took a very long time to be suppressed. Now, if you want to know why China's leaders are scared stiff of the possibility of religion becoming powerful in China, it's because of the Taiping Rebellion. That they think, my gosh, if we're not careful, some peasant from Henan or something may come up with a faith that kind of attracts millions of followers, and that may become a political force. So the Chinese government has been very, very nervous about large religious movements, particularly those that seem to be related to Christian movements. And Christians in China, however orthodox they are, they've had to kind of be super patriotic in order to prove that they are not trying to overthrow the government. And of course this leads to interesting issues like, should China's Christians be agitating for civil rights? Well, many of them are. Many of the Chinese human rights lawyers are very committed Christians and have done courageous work. Some Chinese Christians are really agitating for the release of the imprisoned Nobel Prize winner, Liu Xiaobo, who, as far as we know, is not actually a Christian or a church member or anything, but he's a very remarkable man with brilliant ideas, and ideas that would really be very good for China if they could be implemented. So the Taiping Rebellion has certainly cast a big cloud over the situation in China. Yeah?
You spoke of the fact that the intellectuals are embracing Christianity. How about the young people in the cities and in the countryside? How is it growing there? By what means?
Well, it grew up very fast in the countryside, especially amongst young people. I'll give you some statistics, some recent statistics. There are at least 40 Chinese universities where there are departments of religious studies in which the professors are professing Christian believers. That's more than you can find in any American university, frankly. And at these 40 campuses, and many others too, there are known to be student-based Bible study, prayer groups, and so forth. So it's obviously a very attractive faith for young people in the cities as well as the countryside. One reason being that most Chinese, however ambitious they are really fed up with corruption. They're just sick of the connections that you need in order to get ahead in business and so forth. And they'd like to see a society which is cleaned up with that. I mean, it's true that China's communist leader Hu Jintao has talked about a harmonious society, and he certainly doesn't want to see corruption. But as far as we know, his injunctions haven't really yielded much fruit amongst ordinary people. Well, I guess, yes?
Sir, I have a couple questions. What's your best estimate as the percentage of the population in China that is Christian?
Right.
Number one. And number two is, do you see any pressure? I guess you mentioned it, but any more concrete forms of pressure that are being put on the Chinese government by the Christian movement?
Right.
Recently, I guess read an article about the Chinese president saying democracy or democratic tendencies are inevitable in China. And there's something that words to that effect.
Yeah.
Do you think the Christian movement is having any upward pressure?
Well, I don't know, to be honest. I mean, I don't know. I've heard Chinese leaders say, well, I haven't physically heard them, but I've seen it reliably reported. Chinese leaders have said Christianity is one of the best things for us socially, because in places where Christianity is strong, on the whole, people commit less crimes, there's less juvenile delinquency, family stability is higher, and so on. It's a huge question how many Christians are there in China. Most people seem to be comfortable with a figure of around 80 million or more. I've heard Communist Party officials say it's 125 million. We don't know. If it's 125 million, you're approaching 10%, which is a very, very big figure. But, you know, there's no way, nobody's done a census of this. It's all guesswork in a way. But anecdotal evidence is really quite strong. For example, in the 1980s, there were articles in the English language Beijing newspapers, China Daily, where local cadres, Communist Party officials, were complaining that certain provinces had certain counties that they called Jesus nests. And this was a real problem. How do we deal with these Jesus nests, where nobody wants to go to a Communist Party meeting and they're all going to prayer meetings and awful things like that? So there are parts of China clearly that are much more strongly Christianized than others, certain parts of rural communities. But we know that many of the human rights lawyers, for example, Gao Zhisheng was the very badly persecuted human rights lawyer. He won the Chinese Lawyer of the Year award in 2001, but then he turned his work to protecting Falun Gong practitioners who'd been persecuted. Then he became a Christian. Then he started criticizing the Chinese government, and then he got into big trouble, and he was basically snatched off the street by a bunch of thugs and beaten and tortured, and finally sort of released under house arrest early this year. But there's some very brave lawyers out there who represent not just Christians, but all kinds of victims of sort of political persecution and human rights persecution in China. And I think clearly they are having some effect. Yes?
I think you perhaps may know Paul Liu. Or
Yes.
Peng.
Yes.
In the last year, he's been showing up in the China Daily and other places with his work to try to bring the rule of law to religion in China.
Right.
Do you have any feel for the trajectory of that, and whether that's, he said he's going to continue doing it as long as they'll let him, and they continue to let him do it, and he's
Right.
an Academy of Sciences,
Right.
Social Sciences.
Right.
Any thoughts about him?
Well, it's very interesting you mentioned Liu Peng. Liu Peng, or Paul Liu as he's known in English, has vigorously campaigned for a change in China's religious law to bring it into line with law in civilized countries, if you like, where as long as you don't commit a crime, you can believe or not believe anything you want to. And one of his objectives has been to get rid of this cumbersome bureaucratic apparatus that controls the Protestant churches of China and the Catholic churches of China. It's called the Three Self-Patriotic Association for the Protestants and the Catholic Patriotic Association. And his argument is, why are Chinese taxpayers forking over what they do fork over for these guys to wander around in limos with curtains on the back doing absolutely nothing? I mean, it's just a complete waste of money and time, and you know, the whole system should be ended. And many Chinese officials have sort of come to that conclusion. The trouble is, and this is the sort of dirty little secret of the whole thing, China's official Christians are the most left-wing people in China. The Three Self-Patriotic movement is full of warmed-over 1960s leftists, and they are digging in their heels to keep their jobs and not to be kicked out. And so it's quite a tough effort that Paul Liu is operating. Yes, sir.
So then is the spread of Christian faith kind of hinging on attrition of this?
No, I don't think so. I think all the evidence is the Chinese Christian faith is continuing to grow in spite of, or maybe because of, the kind of pressure that it's under. I mean, if you're a professional in China and you start showing up at church on a regular basis, or your friends are all Christian, people will start asking questions, and you may hit the glass ceiling of your particular profession unless it's in the arts or academic life. But I don't think there's any evidence that the growth of the church in China has slowed down. And one of the most interesting things, maybe I should sort of really finish my presentation with this thought, is that many of China's house church Christians, the house church is the name given to the communities of Christians, not just in the countryside, but mostly in the countryside and in the cities. They have a vision of themselves as completing the missionary movement that started in Jerusalem in the 1st century. And there's a movement in China called Back to Jerusalem. And it's a very interesting movement. I found this movement all over China. And what they basically say is, we are the only people who can bring Christianity to the sort of the what we call the 1040 window. If you look at all the people between China and Jerusalem, you've got Buddhists and Muslims and so forth. The Chinese believe that they are the only people who would be acceptable as missionaries, and Americans probably would not be acceptable in some areas. So that's a very interesting tail wagging the dog. I mean, I've met Chinese Christians who have enrolled in Arabic language courses and taken jobs that would allow them to go to places like Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Sudan, precisely in order to be missionaries. This is tent making in a very interesting way.
We have plenty of time for those of you who have to go back to studying, learning, and comment on religion by 2000 and you're welcome to go. But I think to add what Dr. Ekman said, religion also is a very, very powerful weapon of the dissent. I mean, recently, if you look at some of the guys who were really at the forefront of challenging the regime, and they were all Christians. I mean, they have an enormous sense of fellowship, number one. I mean, the leading, I would use the word patriotic critic of the government was a gentleman by the name of Yu Jie. Oh, yeah. Yu Jie is a very prominent Christian. He's like in early 30s, white. He wrote a book. Know him quite well. Yeah, he wrote a book mocking the Chinese premier who was talking about democracy. He's the best actor of China. And he had free access to American ambassador to China, Huntsman, who's a devout Mormon. And so there is a very strong sense that if you look at this international relation between China and the rest of the world, religion plays a very important role. I mean, look at all the trouble spots in China, Tibet, Xinjiang, is Buddhism and Muslim, all those problems, and in a very fundamental way, it's a religious problem. And the Chinese underground church had this kind of very strong oblique descent. I mean, number one, they have religion, they have theology. Number two, they have organization. Number three, they have, if you're Catholic, you have a object of loyalty to which you're loyal and which is foreign. And that's really is a very powerful threat to the Chinese government. On the other hand, there are so many of them in China, sort of semi-unofficial. And China, people always say, is a land of polytheism. It's very hard to find people with a very clearly defined religious identification because you could be Buddhist, communist, all at the same time. But gradually, people were making that very distinction very clear, and yet not very revealing to a lot of people. So that's really, the government really has no idea how big the church is. I mean, that's really,
yeah, I think that's true.
It's an amazing thing. And this year marks the 400th year anniversary of Michael Rich's death in Beijing. 1610, he died in Beijing, and he had about 2,000 Christians by the time. And people are making big effort in China to celebrate that. And of course, sort of mufflers there.
Yeah.
Anyway, if no further question, and I think I would like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Eichmann for the excellent survey and great conversation with us. And hopefully you'll continue to join the rest of the program. And as a token of our gratitude, I present Dr. Eichmann with this covered item of the Naval Academy paperweight. Which is
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's great. Thank you. That's great.
Okay, good night.